Azeroth is huge, and to build that world and then fill it up with content, Blizzard had to draw on many sources and blend all sorts of different influences. And this is stuff that is core to the franchise, because there are some references that are for the sake of a quest or an NPC, but there are influences embedded in the DNA of World of Warcraft, and that is what we are going to do today. So, let's look at what inspired the story, the setting, and the lore of World of Warcraft. Let's go all the way back to those first production meetings, when the first person said, "Hey, wouldn't demons from outer space be cool?" And see where all of that came from. We're gonna talk Dungeons & Dragons, Warhammer, random Pulp Fiction paperbacks, and a whole bunch more as we work out this mystery. Let's begin with the earliest influences that went into Warcraft 1 and 2, the very core of our setting. We all know the story, right? Twin brothers. One of them is rash. He sells his soul to evil forces for power. The other one is moral, fighting for the good of his race. The rash brother has enchanted eyes, foretelling great things. The mortal brother has to earn his power, though. Then we have the love interest of these two characters, a priestess who thinks she can use the power of both brothers for the greater good. That's right, I'm actually talking about brothers Caramon and Rastalin from the Dungeons & Dragons setting Dragonlance. Though you'd be forgiven for thinking I was talking about Illidan and Malfurion Stormmage, as well as Tyrande. They were very likely inspired by the protagonists of Dragonlance. And this is a connection that was actually reinforced further in Legion, with the appearance of Karam and Rhaest Mage Spear in the Order Hall campaigns. Clear references, and that is right when we were exploring Illidan and Malfurion's past. Dragonlance was a huge influence on Warcraft since the start. The developers for Warcraft 1 played Dungeons & Dragons, they loved the novels, and they wanted to create that blend of high fantasy and planet hopping for their setting. Chris Metzen joined Blizzard Entertainment to work on Warcraft 2, and that took the inspiration to the next level. He basically stated that he wanted to create the next Dragonlance. And you can see the influence in characters like Medivh versus Dragonlance's Rastalin. By the way, I don't really know how to pronounce them properly, but there you go. But both of these characters, the most powerful casters in their setting, were possessed by evil. They opened portals to other realms, and they went from villain to hero to save their worlds. It's the broad strokes where there are the most similarities. Green dragons are the guardians of the dream realm, which has become infected with a living nightmare. Where have we seen that before? There was even a world-sundering event that split the main continent in two. There are the Darganesti, a race of evil sea creatures who had once been elves. Like the Naga. And the connection between these two settings was very much cemented whenever Blizzard hired Richard Knack, a prolific Dragonlance author, to write basically all of the dragon lore of Warcraft. Day of the Dragon released a year before Warcraft 3, establishing the dragon aspects lore, the dragon soul, and setting the tone for even the Kirin Tor, dwarven politics, and the scheming things of the Black Dragonflight. And that last point was particularly important for vanilla, as it gave us Nefarian in Blackrock Spire, and of course, Katrina Prester in Stormwind. And if you know the lore of Stormwind, pretty much every problem, from the Defias in Westfall to the Orcs in Redridge, it all began with the Black Dragonflight. Some of Warcraft's earliest influences can only be speculated on, but some of them are a lot more compelling, and one of those sources is C.J. Cherry's Morgraine series. In the books, the land of Ander Kush is dotted with dimensional gates that can be used to travel a huge cosmos. The gates are the source of all magic, and if they're misused, they can destroy civilizations, like what happened to Draenor. Now, the third book in this series is called The Fire of Azeroth, and that might actually be our earliest reference for the word Azeroth. But there are in fact more similarities. In it, the main villain goes to a distant, dying world and promises its natives a new planet to conquer. The natives then set aside their differences and they form a horde to invade this new world. And that was, with a few changes, the orc story from the Warcraft 1 manual. Now, although the lore has since changed, this seed, potentially from the Morgraine series, gave us the dark beginnings of orc lore. And then also, there is the surname. I mean, we all know Darian Morgraine, and so on and so forth. But of course, there are yet more references. Now for one that you likely know, but there is a little bit of a twist here because there is another theory for the name Azeroth. While many do think it comes from Fires of Azeroth, that book, another common theory goes that Azeroth is in fact based on Azathoth, the Lord of the Outer Gods in H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos. It's very much not hard to believe this, given how many other Lovecraft references there are in World of Warcraft. In fact, to do an exhaustive list would probably take upwards of half an hour, but you've got, Cthulhu for Cthulhu, Yogg-Saron from Yogg-Sothoth, you have Nyarlathotep, the H.P. Lovecraft character, and you've got Ny'alotha. There's a lot of similarities there. Just read the Nyarlathotep story. Lovecraft's work, of course, is now public domain because, he died a very long time ago, so it's basically just free depth, and that's why you see the Lovecraft mythos be expanded upon by so many. Hey, the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young. Is that a line from the puzzle box of Yogg-Saron, or from Lovecraft? Even, in strange aeons, even death may die. You have many, many different quotes and whisperings and things that are very much inspired by things from Lovecraft. During Wrath of the Lich King, there was even community theories that Azeroth herself was an old god. Of course, because of the Lovecraft naming convention, Azeroth, Azathoth. But no. We've met Azeroth, and she's a titan. But if Azathoth was in fact the Lord of the Outer Gods, could Azeroth be the true Lord of the Titans? Who knows? There was a point where I thought the Draenei were a completely original Blizzard creation. Maybe not so much. We thought that this was something Blizzard really tried to do, make it feel new and fresh, after, of course, vanilla World of Warcraft was very much a rehash of the Dungeons & Dragons monster manual, and we thought the Draenei were there to create something new for the setting. Now, of course, as many of you will know, the Draenei are tieflings from Dungeons & Dragons. But the name Draenei might actually be lifted from David Gemmell's Draenei series. Yep, and beyond even the title of the series, there are similarities, because in the book, a group known as the Draenei are brought to near extinction by the Nadir Horde. In our setting, the first reference to the Draenei was in Warcraft 2's manual, as a random race that the Horde had wiped out before coming to Azeroth. But of course, that lore has since evolved greatly, including that exile story, which does seem a little bit similar to what was going on in the book. Overall, though, the Draenei have really went places. They are one of my favorite races and stories in the game, and it does show what Blizzard can do, and they take a little bit of an influence, they remix it, and then you get something that feels new and cool and fresh. Warhammer. It's the big question, right? Was Warcraft 1 supposed to be a Warhammer game? I mean, hey, people look at the Terran Protoss Zerg, and they kind of think of Eldar, Tyranids, and Space Marines, right? From Warhammer 40k. I mean, look at the green orcs with their big jaws and their Mongol hats, exactly like the orcs from early Warhammer. Well, Peter Wyatt, the first person to write code for a Warcraft game, actually confirmed that it was only ever a suggestion from Blizzard founder Alan Adam. In his Code of Honor blog, Wyatt explained the plan didn't go anywhere because Blizzard actually lacked the business connection with Games Workshop. Of course, more importantly for the future of the setting, the dev team also wanted to keep the IP in-house, which, you know what, I think we can all be rather thankful for. So, Warcraft was never meant to be an official game, for Warhammer that is, but Warhammer undoubtedly had an influence on our setting. Let's just do a few examples, and one of them caused us to lose our marbles when we found it out, and it's this one. Originally, the runes on Frostmourne were Eltharin, the elven runes from Warhammer Fantasy. Yeah, if you're going around as Tyrion in Warhammer 2 Total War, the runes that guy writes in were on Frostmourne in early versions of the cinematic, including what shipped. Now, this was later changed to the runes that we know today, but yeah, the initial Frostmourne runes were lifted wholesale from Warhammer. Beyond that, you've got, say, Kel'Thuzad, whose life seems rather inspired by the necromancer Heinrich Kemmler, and later, when a lich, on Nagash himself. I think if you look at the Scourge in Warcraft 3, you can very clearly see the influences of both the Vampire Counts, but also the Tomb King's faction from Warhammer Fantasy. So, it's kind of neat. But that's not the biggest faction similarity. For that, we've got to look at the Burning Legion's connection to Chaos. Both are factions filled with demons. If you kill them, they go back to their home realm and respawn. Their numbers increase through corruption. You know, like with the Space Marines or the Eridar. The demons are, they're similar in that sort of blend of, dark magic and technology. I mean, could we have had the Fel Reaver without the Chaos Titans? So it's pretty neat stuff, actually. And I think that actually means that a bunch of us who enjoy the Warcraft lore, maybe some of the Cosmic Warcraft lore, let me tell you, if you get into some of that Warhammer stuff, I think you'll have quite a fun time indeed. Tolkien time! Have you ever wondered why orcs are green? Because they're not green in Lord of the Rings, and that's where a lot of modern fantasy orcs come from. Well, we were doing research here, and we found that some of the earliest references were from Warhammer Fantasy for green orcs. But we actually found the first rendition of green orcs that it actually comes from Tim Kirk's painting, The Roads to Minas Tirith, which is, of course, based on Lord of the Rings. So it does turn out that green orcs are a product of Tolkien as well, even though I'm fairly sure that green is not the default Tolkien description for how they actually look. Now, Tolkien, of course, established what we basically take for granted in fantasy. Heroic bands of adventurers made up of humans, elves, and dwarves going on a quest, raiding the Dark Lord's dungeons, finding some sweet loot, doing all of that. I mean, that's the content loop of many games, right? We could probably see more direct references in The Lich King and The Witch King, perhaps in Icecrown and Cirith Ungol. Quite a few things there, but of course, it's Tolkien. I mean, you trace the fantasy family tree back, you're going to get to his stuff. Next, it's time to give Christie Golden her due. Because, you see, the cut game, Warcraft Adventures Lord of the Clans, combined with some very tight writing deadlines, gave Blizzard the opportunity to actually write a heroic orc protagonist. And it's Christie Golden who managed to pull this off. A young thrall, originally meant to be found in the battlefield, escapes his reservation and explores Azeroth. He discovers the shocking truth that orcs are not inherently evil. In fact, they had abandoned their previously good shamanistic ways and became corrupted by demons. This was the intended recontextualization of the orcs from bloodlusting villains to rational, if a little angry, the guys we know today. Warcraft Adventures, the game, was supposed to end with Thrall rallying the orc clans and leading an attack against the humans. But of course, that's not how any of it panned out exactly, is it? We all know that, because this game was cancelled. But Chris Metzen thought the lore was too important. So Blizzard hired Christie Golden. They gave her the outline and the scripts for the cut game, and this is the bit that shocked me when I did the research. They gave her 6 weeks to write the book. Yeah, Christie Golden shored up and made that iconic orc lore, got it into a great novel in 6 weeks. God damn, that's pretty impressive. And that is how we got the book, Lord of the Clans. Yeah, pretty cool. And the biggest difference between the cut game and Golden's novel was basically tone, because originally Thrall was a young orc mystified by the prospect of exploring Azeroth. But in the novel, Thrall is a grim, determined, and incredibly powerful shaman. Instead of the almost comical depiction of some of the orcs in the game, which you could maybe see as, it was a sort of point-and-click adventure, that was sort of the thing in the genre. But no, Lord of the Clans gave us a broken people trying to forge their destiny in a world that wanted them dead. It's a great book, it's a great story. Christie Golden really managed to pull the orcs together and do a great job with it. Thrall's story in Warcraft 3 was a direct continuation of the book's narrative, and we all know how important that was for the future of the orcs, the Horde, and of course, the setting of Warcraft. The late 90s and early 2000s is really when so much of the Warcraft lore was solidified. At that time, Warcraft 3 and WoW sort of shared a production cycle and had the same narrative lead. So, whilst the final beats of Warcraft 3 were being implemented into the campaigns, Blizzard were actually planning out the zones for World of Warcraft. This world was so huge and needed filled, so Blizzard threw in a bunch of stuff and, just sort of went to see what would stick. They actually had sketched out 9 factions for Warcraft 3, but we only got 4. I mean, not that was a problem, it was a great game. But can you imagine the story, the setting of Warcraft if we got all 9? Because even then, the story was radically different. 2 of the original factions were Wood Elves and Dark Elves, but fairly late in production, both of those races were scrapped, and they were then merged into a new, unique Night Elf faction. Of course, a race that is core to the game today, and it actually came about through compromise. Even stranger, they were originally themed around insects. So, quite different indeed. Going into some of their original ideas is really like reading an alternative history. For instance, in Warcraft 3, Arthas destroys Quel'Thalas, killing Sylvanas and turning her into the Banshee that still haunts us to this very day. Well, the first draft of that lore actually stated that Quel'Thalas had been long destroyed during the Second War, and that the High Elves had actually been radicalized into a group of hyper-aggressive casters who lived in Lordaeron. Now, this lore would eventually find a home in the Blood Elves. But what would the setting have looked like without a Quel'Thalas destroyed by the Scourge? Would the Blood Elves even have been a thing? Quel'Thas and Illidan, would that have happened? Would Sylvanas have become the leader of the Forsaken faction, or even met the Jailer? It is amazing when you trace all these things back to their earliest drafts and ideas. This was one of my favorite facets of experimentation changing the lore. Murlocs. We still don't have a citation for this, but it's a neat story. It's believed that a Blizzard artist thought that Warcraft 3 needed more creeps, so they reskinned a ghoul into a fish creature, and suddenly we had Murlocs. It was such a evocative idea that the Warcraft 3 manual mentioned mutated Murlocs living somewhere deep in the ocean, and then of course, in the expansion, we got the Naga. Now, we didn't know how to connect all of the dots at the time, but everyone knows what a Murloc is, and they're pretty fundamental to the lore. At the very least, they're very iconic. To wrap up then, we've got the obvious stuff. Real-world cultures and mythologies. Back in vanilla, the Uldaman dungeon was the first Titan facility that we found, and its Greek architecture and Olympian names just blended into the background of the game's references. But of course, as time went on, we found more Titan facilities, and it became clear that Blizzard were basing them on real-world different cultures. And honestly, that's satisfying to me in the same way that seeing Stargate flesh out its universe and its aliens was really satisfying. Of course, Northrend, lots of direct Norse references. I mean, we've got Odin, the Allfather who lived in the halls of Valor, Valhalla. There's Helya, the Maiden of the Underground, whose Cavalier warriors raided us on their long ships that emerged from the mist. In Cataclysm, of course, we saw what was behind that wall in Uldum, and it was something straight out of Middle Kingdom Egypt. The pyramids and the Titan Keepers named after gods. And then all the obvious ones, You've got the Tauren, pretty obvious inspirations there over in America. The dwarves, I just hear they might be Scottish, and a bunch of other things. I mean, hell, the Drust, Ardenweald, that kind of comes into a little bit of our wheelhouse. A bit of Ireland is there, or at least, Celtic stuff. Well, Celtic stuff, Gaelic stuff, there's a whole bunch there. Anyway, that's how the setting really matured. Blizzard, really, over time, they no longer do these rough amalgamations of fantasy references, right? They're not finding their favorite paperback fantasy novels and sort of remixing them into the game. Instead, now they really far more find an art direction for a zone or a race or expansion, and then they take a lot more reference from real world, history and mythology, and try to blend it into something uniquely Blizzard. Shadowlands, I think, is a big example of that, with each realm of the afterlife being based very much on real-world things, like Bastion and the Elysium Fields, or Revendreth and Dante's Inferno, but of course, remixed and reframed into something that does end up feeling fairly unique. So to conclude then, Azeroth is a big old world, and we can only get through a few of the inspirations for the lore in today's video, but it is clear that Blizzard took from many, many, many different sources when building up their world. But of course, it's what they did with these sources, how they brought them together, that made it all such a compelling world. I think it's also clear that we're all, playing in Tolkien's house, that fantasy as a genre does share many, many tropes, and it's really just what you do with these tropes, how you tell your stories, what art you place, your own spin on it. That's what makes for a compelling setting for, I think, something like World of Warcraft. Now, there is something to be said for doing a humongously unique and adventurous and totally new world-building exercise, but for so much of Blizzard's history, even in regards to other games, what they were really known for wasn't really being the most innovative, fresh, new thinkers who were blowing us away with these crazy new ideas. It was more that they would take a bunch of things, they'd remix them, and they'd sort of execute on them with that, at the time, trademark Blizzard polish. And I think that's what led to Warcraft being such a mass success. So there you go. That is where Warcraft came from. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.